Imagine this. You're boarding a flight, exhausted after a long day, just wanting to sink into your seat and relax. But as you step onto the plane, you witness something that stops you in your tracks. A flight attendant, calm but firm, is refusing to let a passenger take his seat. The passenger? A polite, unassuming man in his late 40s dressed in a simple button-down shirt and slacks. He looks like any ordinary traveler, maybe a teacher or an office worker. But what the flight attendant doesn't know, what no one on that plane knows, is that this man isn't just any passenger. He's the owner of the entire airline. And this seemingly small conflict is about to turn into a moment no one will ever forget. The story begins on a busy Monday morning at a bustling international airport. Flights are delayed, passengers are irritable, and the gate agents are doing their best to keep things moving. Among the crowd is Mr. Daniel Harper, a high school history teacher from a small town. At least, that's what everyone assumes. Daniel is soft-spoken, carrying a worn leather satchel and a thermos of coffee. He's the kind of person who blends into the background, the kind of person you might not notice unless you really looked. But today, Daniel isn't heading to a classroom. He's on his way to a high-stakes meeting, one that could change the future of the airline industry, and he's flying on one of his own planes. As Daniel approaches his first-class seat, he's stopped by a flight attendant named Claire. Claire is sharp, efficient, and used to dealing with difficult passengers, but today she's made a mistake, a big one. She glances at Daniel's ticket and frowns. "I'm sorry, sir," she says, her tone polite but firm. "This seat is reserved for VIP passengers. You'll need to return to the economy cabin." Daniel pauses, confused. He double-checks his ticket, then looks up at Claire. "There must be some mistake," he says calmly. "This is my seat." Claire shakes her head, her patience wearing thin. "I'm afraid not, sir. Please return to your assigned seat, or I'll have to call security. The other passengers are watching now, some whispering, others openly staring. A few are annoyed at the holdup, while others are curious about the quiet man being turned away." Daniel hesitates, his mind racing. He could reveal who he is, of course. He could end this situation with a single sentence, but something stops him. Maybe it's the way Claire is looking at him, her expression a mix of professionalism and barely concealed frustration. Or maybe it's the realization that this moment, this small, seemingly insignificant conflict, is about to reveal something much bigger about power, perception, and the way we treat one another. As the tension builds, Daniel makes a decision. He doesn't argue, he doesn't pull rank. Instead, he simply nods, picks up his bag, and walks back toward the economy cabin. Claire watches him go, relieved that the situation has been resolved. But as she turns to assist another passenger, she can't shake the feeling that something isn't quite right. Who was that man? Why did he give up so easily? And why did he seem so familiar? Meanwhile, Daniel settles into a cramped middle seat near the back of the plane. He opens his satchel, pulls out a notebook, and begins to write. But his mind isn't on the meeting he's about to attend. It's on Claire, on the passengers around him, on the way this entire situation unfolded. Because Daniel Harper isn't just the owner of the airline. He's a man who believes in fairness, in second chances, in the power of humility. And as the plane taxis down the runway, he knows one thing for certain. This flight is about to change. Everything, but how? What will happen when the truth comes out? Will Claire realize her mistake? Will the other passengers discover the man they overlooked is the one who owns the very plane they're flying on? And what will Daniel do next? The answers are coming, but for now, the tension is palpable, the stakes are high, and the story is just beginning. Stay tuned, because this is one flight you won't want to miss. As the plane climbs steadily into the sky, Daniel Harper sits quietly in his economy seat, his notebook resting on the fold-down tray in front of him. The hum of the engines fills the cabin, a steady backdrop to the murmurs of conversation around him. He glances out the window, watching the ground shrink below, but his mind is far from the clouds. He's thinking about Claire, the flight attendant, who had no idea who he was. He's thinking about the way she handled the situation. Firm, professional, but with an edge of impatience that suggested she'd dealt with one too many difficult passengers that day. And he's thinking about the irony of it all. The owner of the airline sitting in the last row of economy because a member of his own staff didn't recognize him. Daniel isn't angry. If anything, he's intrigued. He spent years building his airline from the ground up, starting with a single plane and a dream. He's always prided himself on being hands-on, on understanding every aspect of his business. But today, for the first time in a long time, he's seeing things from a completely different perspective. He's not the CEO in a tailored suit, walking through the airport with an entourage. He's just another passenger, another face in the crowd, and it's giving him a glimpse into a world he hasn't truly experienced in years. Meanwhile, Claire is going about her duties, moving through the cabin with practiced ease. She's been a flight attendant for nearly a decade, and she's seen it all, from unruly passengers to medical emergencies. But something about the man she turned away is nagging at her. She can't quite put her finger on it, but there was something in his demeanor, something in the way he looked at her that felt different. Most passengers would have argued or at least protested, but he didn't. He just accepted it and walked away. It's unusual, and it's bothering her more than she cares to admit. As she passes through the economy cabin, she glances in his direction. He's writing in a notebook, his head bent low, completely absorbed in whatever he's working on. For a moment, she considers stopping to apologize, to double-check his ticket and make sure there wasn't a mistake. But the plane is full, and there are other passengers who need her attention. She pushes the thought aside and focuses on her job, but the image of the quiet man in the back row stays with her. Back in his seat, Daniel is jotting down notes, not about the meeting he's heading to, but about the experience he's just had. He's always believed that the true measure of a company is how it treats its customers and its employees. And today, he's seeing both sides of that equation in a way he never has before. He wonders how many other passengers have been turned away from their seats, how many have felt dismissed or overlooked, and he wonders how many of his employees, like Claire, are doing their best under difficult circumstances, but might be missing the bigger picture. The flight continues, the hours passing slowly. Daniel occasionally glances up from his notebook, observing the other passengers. There's a young couple with a baby, trying to soothe the crying child, an elderly man struggling to open a bag of peanuts, a group of college students laughing and sharing headphones. To everyone else, Daniel is just another face in the crowd. But to him, this is a rare opportunity to see his airline and his own leadership through the eyes of the people who matter most, the passengers. As the plane begins its descent, Claire makes her final rounds through the cabin, collecting trash and preparing for landing. When she reaches Daniel's row, she pauses, her eyes meeting his for the first time since the incident at boarding. "Can I get you anything before we land?" she asks, her tone polite but distant. Daniel looks up, his expression calm and unreadable. "No, thank you," he says simply. Claire hesitates as if she wants to say more, but then nods and moves on. The plane touches down smoothly, and the passengers begin to gather their belongings, eager to disembark. Daniel stays seated, letting the others go ahead. He's in no rush. His meeting isn't for a few hours, and he wants to take his time to think about what he's just experienced. As the cabin empties, he finally stands, slinging his satchel over his shoulder. He glances toward the front of the plane, where Claire is standing by the door, thanking passengers as they leave. Their eyes meet again, and for a brief moment, there's a flicker of recognition in her expression, but then it's gone, and she turns her attention to the next passenger. Daniel steps off the plane and into the terminal, blending seamlessly into the crowd. But as he walks, he can't shake the feeling that something significant has just happened. This wasn't just a flight. It was a lesson, a reminder of why he started his airline in the first place. And as he makes his way through the airport, he knows one thing for certain: the story isn't over. Not yet. What will happen when Claire discovers the truth? How will the other passengers react if they find out the man they ignored was the owner of the airline? And what will Daniel do with the insights he's gained from this experience? The answers are still up in the air, but one thing is clear. This is a story about more than just a seat on a plane. It's about power, perception, and the unexpected, moments that can change everything. And the next chapter is about to begin. As Daniel Harper walks through the bustling airport terminal, his mind is still replaying the events of the flight. The quiet hum of the terminal, the hurried footsteps of travelers, and the occasional announcement over the loudspeaker all fade into the background as he reflects on what just happened. He's not angry, not at Claire, not at the situation. If anything, he's curious. Curious about how his airline operates when he's not around, curious about the experiences of his passengers, and curious about how this small incident might reveal bigger truths about his company. He decides to take a detour before heading to his meeting. Instead of going straight to the executive offices, he finds a quiet corner in the airport cafe, orders a coffee, and sits down with his notebook. He flips through the pages, reading over the notes he scribbled during the flight. They're not just observations about the passengers or the service. They're questions. Questions about how his employees are trained, how policies are enforced, and how passengers are treated when things don't go as planned. He knows his airline prides itself on customer service, but today he's seen a side of it that he hadn't fully considered before. Meanwhile, Claire is in the crew lounge, trying to shake off the strange feeling that's been nagging at her since the flight. She's sitting with a few of her colleagues, sipping a cup of tea and half listening to their chatter. But her mind keeps drifting back to the man she turned away. There was something about him, something she can't quite put into words. She pulls out her phone and opens the airline's employee app, scrolling through the passenger manifest from the flight. She finds his name, Daniel Harper. It doesn't ring any bells, but something about it feels familiar. She shakes her head, dismissing the thought. She's probably overthinking it. Still, she can't help but wonder if she made a mistake. Back in the cafe, Daniel is deep in thought when his phone buzzes. It's a text from his assistant, reminding him about the meeting. He glances at the time and realizes he needs to get going. But before he leaves, he opens the airline's internal app on his phone and pulls up the flight details. He scrolls through the crew list until he finds Claire's name. He hesitates for a moment, then taps on her profile. Her photo shows a confident, professional woman, but Daniel can't help but notice the faint lines of stress around her eyes. He wonders how long she's been working for the airline, what her day-to-day experience is like, and whether she feels supported in her role. These are questions he's never really asked himself before, but now they feel important. As Daniel makes his way to the executive offices, Claire is called into a meeting with her supervisor. She's not sure what it's about, but she can't shake the feeling that it's related to the incident on the flight. When she enters the small conference room, her supervisor, a no-nonsense woman named Linda, is waiting for her. "Claire, have a seat," Linda says, her tone neutral but firm. Claire sits down, her heart pounding. "I've had a complaint from a passenger about the flight earlier," Linda continues. "They said you refused to let someone sit in their assigned seat. Care to explain?" Claire takes a deep breath and recounts the incident as calmly as she can. She explains that the passenger's ticket seemed to be in error, and she followed protocol by asking him to return to his assigned seat. Linda listens, her expression unreadable. When Claire finishes, Linda nods slowly. "I understand," she says, "but we need to be careful about how we handle these situations. The passenger who complained is a frequent flyer, and they weren't happy with how it was handled." Claire feels a knot form in her stomach. She knows how important frequent flyers are to the airline, and she can't help but worry about the consequences. At the same time, Daniel arrives at the executive offices and is greeted by his team. They're eager to discuss the upcoming merger, a deal that could change the future of the airline. But as they sit down in the boardroom, Daniel finds it hard to focus. His mind keeps drifting back to the flight, to Claire, and to the questions he wrote in his notebook. He knows the merger is important, but he can't shake the feeling that there's something more urgent he needs to address. Something about The way his company operates, the way it treats its employees and passengers feels off. As the meeting progresses, Daniel surprises his team by steering the conversation away from the merger and toward customer service. "I want to talk about how we're treating our passengers," he says, his tone serious. "And our employees. Are we giving them the support they need? Are we listening to their concerns?" The room falls silent, his team exchanging puzzled glances. They're not used to this side of Daniel, the side that's more concerned about people than profits. But Daniel knows that if his airline is going to succeed, it needs to be about more than just the bottom line. It needs to be about the people who make it all possible. Meanwhile, Claire is leaving her meeting with Linda, her mind racing. She's been given a warning, a reminder to be more careful in the future. But as she walks back to the crew lounge, she can't help but feel frustrated. She was just doing her job, following the rules. Why does it feel like she's the one being punished? She pulls out her phone again and looks up Daniel Harper's name. This time she does a quick internet search. Her eyes widen as the results load. There, staring back at her, is a photo of the man she turned away, standing in front of one of the airline's planes with the caption, "Daniel Harper, CEO of Horizon Airlines." Claire's heart skips a beat. She feels a mix of emotions, shock, embarrassment, and a strange sense of relief. At least now she knows why he seemed so familiar. But what does this mean for her? Will she lose her job? Will she be reprimanded further? She doesn't know, but one thing is clear. This isn't over, not by a long shot. As the day unfolds, Daniel and Claire are both grappling with the aftermath of the flight, each in their own way. Daniel is questioning the very foundation of his company, while Claire is wondering if she'll ever recover from her mistake. Their paths are on a collision course, and when they finally meet again, the consequences will be far-reaching. But for now, the tension is building, the stakes are rising, and the story is far from over. What will happen next? Stay tuned. Claire's hands tremble as she stares at her phone. The image of Daniel Harper, CEO of Horizon Airlines, burned into her mind. Her chest tightens, and she feels a cold sweat break out on her forehead. She's replayed the moment, in her head 100 times already. The way she'd spoken to him, the way she'd dismissed him, the way she'd sent him to the back of the plane. And now, knowing who he really is, the weight of it all crashes down on her. She feels sick. What if he reports her? What if she loses her job? What if this one mistake, this one moment of following protocol, ends her career? She paces the crew lounge, her mind racing. She knows she needs to do something, but what? Apologize, explain herself. She's not even sure where to find him. For all she knows, he's already in a boardroom, discussing her fate with the higher-ups. The thought makes her stomach churn. She glances at the clock. Her next flight isn't for a few hours, but she can't sit here and wait for the axe to fall. She needs to act. But how? Meanwhile, Daniel is still in the boardroom, but his focus is elsewhere. The meeting has dragged on with his team discussing profit margins and market shares, but his mind keeps drifting back to the flight. He can't stop thinking about Claire, about the way she handled the situation. She was just doing her job, following the rules. But those rules, his rules, had led to a passenger being turned away from their seat. A passenger who happened to be him. But what if it had been someone else, someone who didn't have the power to let it go? The thought unsettles him. He interrupts the meeting, his voice firm. "I want to see the passenger complaint logs for the last 6 months," he says. His team exchanges confused glances, but no one questions him. Within minutes, the data is projected onto the screen. Daniel scans through it, his brow furrowing. There are dozens of complaints about seating issues, about rude staff, about delays and cancellations. Some are minor, but others are more serious. And as he reads, he realizes something. These aren't just isolated incidents. They're symptoms of a bigger problem, a problem he's been too busy to notice. He stands abruptly, startling his team. "I need to make a call," he says, stepping out of the room. He pulls out his phone and dials the number for the head of customer service. When the woman answers, Daniel doesn't waste time. "I want to know how we handle passenger complaints," he says. "And I want to know why so many of them are falling through the cracks." There's a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a hesitant explanation. Daniel listens, his jaw tightening. It's worse than he thought. Back in the crew lounge, Claire has made a decision. She can't just sit here and wait for something to happen. She needs to find Daniel Harper and apologize. She doesn't know if it will make a difference, but she has to try. She grabs her bag and heads out of the lounge, her heart pounding. She doesn't know where to start, but she knows one thing. She's not going down without a fight. As she walks through the terminal, she spots a group of executives heading toward the executive offices. Her breath catches when she sees Daniel among them. He's deep in conversation, his expression serious. Claire hesitates, her courage wavering. What if he doesn't want to hear her apology? What if he's already made up his mind about her? But then she remembers the way he'd looked at her on the plane. Calm, patient, almost understanding. Maybe, just maybe, he'll give her a chance to explain. She takes a deep breath and starts walking toward him, her steps quickening. But before she can reach him, a voice calls out behind her. "Claire!" She turns to see Linda, her supervisor, hurrying toward her. "Where do you think you're going?" Linda asks, her tone sharp. "You're supposed to be preparing for your next flight." Claire opens her mouth to explain, but Linda cuts her off. "I don't want to hear it. You've caused enough trouble already. Get back to work." Claire feels a surge of frustration, but she knows better than to argue. She glances over her shoulder at Daniel, who's now disappearing into the executive offices. Her chance is slipping away. She turns back to Linda, her mind racing. She needs to find a way to talk to Daniel. But how? And what will she say if she does? Meanwhile, Daniel is in his office, staring out the window at the tarmac below. The meeting with his team has left him with more questions than answers. He knows something needs to change, but he's not sure where to start. His phone buzzes, and he glances at the screen. It's a message from his assistant. "The passenger from the flight, Claire, is asking to speak with you. Should I send her in?" Daniel hesitates. He's not sure what to expect, but he knows this conversation could change everything. He takes a deep breath and types a reply. "Send her in." The tension is palpable as Claire steps into the elevator, her heart pounding. She doesn't know what she's going to say, but she knows this is her only chance. The doors slide open and she steps out into the executive suite. The assistant gestures toward Daniel's office, and Claire walks toward it, her steps slow, but determined. She knocks on the door and a voice calls out, "Come in." She pushes the door open and steps inside. Daniel is standing by the window, his back to her. He turns and their eyes meet. For a moment, neither of them speaks. The air is thick with unspoken words, with tension, with the weight of what's about to happen. Claire takes a deep breath, ready to apologize, ready to explain. But before she can say a word, Daniel speaks. "Claire," he says, his voice calm but firm, "we need to talk." The room falls silent, the tension reaching its peak. What will Daniel say? What will Claire do? And how will this conversation change everything? The answers are coming, but for now, the suspense is unbearable. Stay tuned, because the climax is just moments away. Claire's heart feels like it's about to burst out of her chest as she stands in Daniel Harper's office. The room is quiet, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of planes taxiing on the tarmac outside. Daniel's gaze is steady, his expression unreadable. She opens her mouth to speak, to apologize, to explain herself. But before she can get a word out, Daniel holds up a hand, stopping her. "Before you say anything," he begins, his voice calm but carrying an edge of something she can't quite place. "I need to ask you something." Claire freezes, her mind racing. What could he possibly want to ask her? Is this where he fires her? Where he tells her she's made the biggest mistake of her career? She nods silently, bracing herself for the worst. Daniel steps closer, his eyes searching hers. "Why did you turn me away from that seat?" he asks. The question catches her off guard. It's not what she expected. She stammers for a moment, trying to find the right words. I I thought there was a mistake with the ticket, she says finally. It looked like it was assigned to someone else. I was just following protocol. Daniel nods slowly, as if considering her answer. But then he says something that makes her blood run cold. And what if I told you that wasn't the first time something like this has happened? Claire blinks, confused. What do you mean? She asks, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel walks over to his desk and picks up a folder. He opens it and pulls out a stack of papers: passenger complaints, incident reports, and employee feedback forms. He hands them to her, and Claire's hands tremble as she flips through them. Each one tells a similar story: passengers being turned away from their seats, employees following protocol but leaving customers frustrated, and a growing sense of dissatisfaction among both passengers and staff. This isn't just about you, Claire, Daniel says, his tone softer now. This is about a system that's broken, a system that I built, and I need to fix it. Claire looks up at him, her eyes wide. She doesn't know what to say. She expected anger, maybe even a lecture, but this is something else entirely. Before she can respond, Daniel's phone buzzes on his desk. He glances at it, his expression darkening. I need to take this, he says, stepping away. Claire stands there, still holding the folder, her mind spinning. She doesn't know what to do or where to go from here. But one thing is clear. This isn't just about her anymore. This is bigger than both of them. As Daniel takes the call, Claire overhears snippets of the conversation. What do you mean the merger is at risk? He says, his voice tense. We can't afford to lose this deal, not now. Claire's eyes widen. The merger? She's heard rumors about it, of course. Everyone has. But she had no idea it was in trouble. And if it falls through, what does that mean for the airline? For her job? For everyone who works here? Daniel hangs up the phone and turns back to her, his face grim. I need your help, Claire, he says. The words catch her off guard. My help, she repeats, unsure if she heard him correctly. Daniel nods. You've been on the front lines. You've seen how things really work. I need to know what's going wrong, and I need to know how to fix it. And I think you're the person who can help me do that. Claire stares at him, stunned. She came here expecting to be reprimanded, maybe even fired. Instead, she's being asked to help the CEO save the airline. It's a lot to process, but before she can respond, there's a knock at the door. Daniel's assistant steps in, looking flustered. Mr. Harper, there's a situation in the terminal. A group of passengers is protesting. They're saying they were mistreated on their last flight. The media's here and it's starting to get out of hand. Daniel's jaw tightens. I'll handle it, he says, grabbing his jacket. He turns to Claire. Come with me. It's not a request, it's a command. Claire hesitates for a moment, then nods. She doesn't know what she's walking into, but she knows she can't say no. As they step out of the office and into the terminal, the noise hits them like a wall. A crowd is gathered near the gates, holding signs and chanting. Cameras are rolling and reporters are shouting questions. Claire feels a surge of panic. This is bad. Really bad. But Daniel doesn't falter. He walks straight toward the crowd, his head held high. Claire follows, her heart pounding. The protesters spot him and the chanting grows louder. Horizon Airlines doesn't care about its passengers, one man shouts. We deserve better, a woman adds. Daniel raises his hands, trying to calm the crowd. I hear you, he says, his voice steady but loud enough to carry over the noise. And I'm here to listen, but I need you to give me a chance to make things right. The crowd quiets slightly, but the tension is still thick in the air. Claire stands beside Daniel, feeling utterly out of place. But then she notices something, a familiar face in the crowd. It's the elderly man from her flight, the one who had struggled to open his bag of peanuts. He's holding a sign that reads, We're not just passengers, we're people. Something about that sign hits her hard. She thinks about all the passengers she served over the years, all the small moments that added up to something bigger. And she realizes that this isn't just about Daniel or the airline. It's about all of them. The passengers, the employees, The people who make the airline what it is. Daniel is still speaking, trying to calm the crowd, but Claire knows it's not enough. She steps forward, her voice shaking but determined. "I'm sorry," she says, addressing the crowd. "I'm sorry for the way you've been treated. I'm sorry for the mistakes we've made. But I promise you, we're going to do better." "We have to." The crowd falls silent, all eyes on her. Daniel looks at her, his expression unreadable, but before anyone can respond, a voice cuts through the silence. "That's easy to say," a man shouts. "But what are you going to do about it?" The question hangs in the air, heavy and unanswered. Claire looks at Daniel, then back at the crowd. She doesn't have the answers, not yet, but she knows one thing. This is just the beginning. The stakes are higher than ever. The tension is at its peak, and the story is far from over. What will happen next? Stay tuned.